Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Hard Things Podcast. This is your host, Blaine Burgess, and this is episode 45. Episode is going to be titled The Will to Act, after the third chapter of my book that I'm writing. To be completely honest, I'm a little bit stuck on the introduction still, but with each passing day, I get a little bit more clarity, and I think I'm going to be able to write more of this rough draft of the book pretty quickly, and especially not to make excuses, but I have had midterms. Got about one more week of midterms. There's never no tests, but the past couple weeks I've had about 3 or 4 tests basically every week. So this is basically right in the middle of this trimester, and yeah, they're laying it on pretty thick, which it's been fun. I've had some ups and some downs. Overall, just keeping it in between the lines. A lot of B's, a lot of C's, a couple A's. Really just trying to maintain my sanity while also learning a bunch about chiropractic. And one thing I'm excited about so far this trimester is I've dug into clubs a little bit more, branched out into a method of chiropractic called Gonstead, which is the first chiropractor I ever saw was a Gonstead chiropractor. It's just a style of doing things, and I'm very familiar with it. I was adjusted that way for several years in my my youth, so I think it's a good place to start. Definitely some good stuff to learn. It's actually more of an elective rather than like the main curriculum they teach. So, yeah, very interesting stuff for me, not necessarily for you. So I'm gonna keep it moving. Like I said, today's episode is called "The Will to Act." So once again, I'm drawing from media that I love. One movie being Batman Begins and of the Dark Knight series, a little bit Dark Knight, but mostly Batman Begins for this episode. And then a TV show corollary that I kind of had in mind was The Bear. For any of you who know The Bear, it's a cool TV show set in Chicago and has a lot of good themes that are relevant to chapter 3 of my book. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So the will to act, specifically that phrase, comes from the movie Batman Begins. It's said by the main villain, who is also the mentor of Bruce Wayne, aka Batman, before he becomes Batman. Bruce Wayne starts out, the beginning of the movie, spoiler alert for those of you who don't know, Batman's origin story is his parents are murdered, and he is an orphan. So luckily he does have his butler, Alfred, who takes care of him, and that relationship extends on through the entirety of the series. But that basically starts out pretty dark, and then he grows up and he deals with feelings of grief, kind of wants revenge. His crush from childhood becomes like assistant district attorney, and there's a point in time where he goes to Princeton, go figure, a Princeton guy, and then he comes back home for the trial, or I guess the parole hearing of the guy who killed his parents, and they find out he's going to get out for cooperating with a different investigation, and yeah, essentially he shows up with a gun to kill the guy after the hearing, because he pretty much knows he's going to get out. And instead, an assassin from the guy that he testified against kills him. So it kind of takes the opportunity away from him. And this makes him feel pretty angry. But then also, now that the opportunity's gone, was taken from him, he also feels guilty and realizes that that was the wrong thing to want, the wrong thing to do. So thankfully the choice was taken from him before he was able to follow through. Then basically he gets in an argument with his crush from his childhood, and he tells her what he was going to do. And he goes to see the mob boss that called the hit on the gentleman that he was trying to kill, and basically tells him, like, if you don't like it, shove it. I run this town, blah, blah, blah. And Bruce is pretty humbled at this point. Like, he's broken all the way down. He's not really loving Princeton. So he takes off. And in a way that almost only he could, he goes around the world. He kind of has this safety net of being Bruce Wayne. So at any point, he can just reach out and knows that he'll be okay. But he goes deep cover, lives with criminals, gets in jail, tests his fighting skills, basically to the point where he gets noticed by a man who is he becomes his mentor, but also is the bad guy. His name's Ra's al Ghul. In the comics, this is a character that can come back to life. Basically, like, he dies and comes back to life. In this, he doesn't introduce himself as Ra's al Ghul. He introduces himself as a different name. So, although he's not actually living forever, so to speak, he is. He kind of has that theatricality. And that's really what this guy's all about. He is the head of an organization called the League of Shadows. He loves theatricality and deception, which, when directed at kind of criminals and malevolent people, can kind of tip the scales and use fear against people who would prey on the fearful or the less privileged or the vulnerable. So, throwback to last week a little bit about fear and vulnerability. It's kind of using those aspects of human nature against criminals. But the problem is, Ra's al Ghul eventually wants to turn it against everyone. So not just the criminals, and kind of, goes against the so-called morality that he kind of espouses at first. He kind of says the end justifies the means. And basically through the training process, Bruce learns all of the benevolent teachings, or the useful teachings. And he becomes basically the second in command, or lieutenant of the League of Shadows. He's like ready to lead the men, essentially. And there comes a point where there's a criminal. He says, all right, basically to lead these men, you have to kill this criminal. You have to execute this guy who stole land from his neighbor, whatever. And Bruce is faced with a choice. And I think this is very significant. It's something that we all face in life. We have a choice to basically stand for our morals. Like, what are our morals? Like, he got into this League of Shadows thing because they were going to use these tactics against the wicked people in the world. And turns out it's not entirely true. But Bruce is kind of committed to his plan. He wants to do it on his own. So he figures out a way to kind of light their castle on fire, and takes out a lot of the people, and then leaves Ra's al Ghul for dead. leaves the house burning, and then basically goes back to his life. So at this point, he was gone like 7 years, and goes back to Gotham City, which is basically New York City, to fight crime, fight injustice. So all of that happened, basically the point where he actually turned against Ra's al Ghul, I think, was preceded by another moment. And this is where the will to act comes in. So there's a point in time where they're training on ice with swords, and they're duking it out. And while they're fighting, I think Ra's al Ghul was trying to get Bruce going emotionally, and he starts talking about his dad. And the way they were murdered, there's a guy with a gun, and they were held up at gunpoint, and the criminal got nervous and kind of shot his dad and his mom, in haste, like just almost by mistake, because they weren't resisting. They were just going to give the stuff and let him go. And so it's definitely a tragedy, definitely something that didn't need to happen on all accounts, the criminal and everyone, and definitely Bruce too. And Ra's al Ghul starts kind of digging at him and going, the reason this happened to your family, it's not your fault. And I think Bruce felt guilty because he wanted to leave the opera because he got scared of bats, go figure, that were in the opera show. So he felt responsible, but Ra's al Ghul, in telling him that he wasn't responsible, which is true, really the person responsible was the criminal, but he instead turns it on his dad and says his dad wasn't ready to fight and should have been at all times. He wasn't prepared for the moment, and that's his fault. And in a way, you could argue that maybe as like a secondary truth. And definitely something that I think about. Like, it doesn't really cost anything to try to go out the front door of a building or, whatever. But that wasn't in the script. Like, his parents had to die so that he could become Batman, whatever. But Bruce kind of knows this isn't true, and Ra's al Ghul really kind of hammers it home, even though it's really not conducive to training. And again, you could try to say he was throwing him off emotionally and trying to train him to fight controlled even when he's pissed, whatever it may be. But it's a good scene, and Bruce loses his sword. He slides over, picks the sword up, and then thinks that he got Ra's al Ghul, and then he taps the ice, and Bruce falls in the ice. And then afterwards, they're sitting around a fire, and Bruce has a blanket on him, and he's teaching him how to warm himself up from the super cold water. So it's a little heartwarming. So he obviously didn't really have any ill intention, but that was the first time you could see kind of the sadistic nature of Ra's al Ghul. And I think Bruce noticed, okay, maybe this isn't exactly what it seems. So what he ultimately said about his father was he just lacked the will to act. And that's where this chapter comes in. I think sometimes life can feel so big and so daunting. The responsibility of it, like we were talking about for chapter 1, fear and vulnerability is very scary. Those things can loom large over you. And it can kind of feel a little bit like, what's the point? And again, that's where will to act comes in. People who maybe are depressed in life. I definitely have had my moments myself. Inertia, I think, is a major, major force, not just in physics, but in emotions and spirit. I think genuinely that force is needed. Pressure creates diamonds. And at a certain point, you've got to build yourself up like Bruce did when he went abroad. And then at some point, you got to come out of that shell. And I know so many people who are kind of struggling underground, deep in their shell, maybe slightly isolated, super hyper independent, and just building themselves, but also maybe a little bit afraid, or, and they just haven't found that will to quite break through yet. And I think this is something that's so beautiful about humanity. I think I've always been kind of the mind of like, just use your willpower and bust out of it, and like, something's wrong with me if I can't do that. But in reality, there's so much about a human being, our body chemistry, like physical body, our spiritual, like mental, emotional. Like, you might not have information you need. You might not have felt feelings you need to feel and get rid of. You might not have, done the training to like look the way you want, to be able to do the feats that you want in life. And there's spiritual work too, where maybe you collected some negative karma and you haven't served the world in a way that can negate that yet, and turn it positive, turn it in your favor and in favor of the world. So there's so many aspects that you need to kind of look inward and fix. And to be quite honest, the world is harsh. And as you're doing that, you may not have enough time or resources to get all the way there. It's kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing in my experience. Healing is definitely not linear. And my experience has been that way, and it's allowed me to have compassion for people who seemingly relapse or go backwards. They do something that they hadn't done in a while because they got in a familiar, stressful situation. And I look at myself and I see that happen to me. And now I think just the awareness of that, as I'm going through it, I can make a different choice that is really, really powerful. And once you get to that point, I think it's just right before you're about to break out. And so for me, that's what chiropractic school is to me. I genuinely think that these couple of years, I call it 3 years for the next 30. And at the end of it, I'll be about 64, 65, and will have done my service to humanity. And then from there, if I'm healthy, I can still practice. I can, support my family. There's all kinds of things I'll be able to do at that point. So right now, these 3 years are scary. It's kind of a time of rapid growth and transformation. But my will has always been strong, and now I think I actually have the tools to see it through. So that's really the key, is having the willpower, and then also just making sure you have the right tools. And that's ultimately, to bring it back to Bruce Wayne before we sign off with the bear, that's what Bruce ultimately does. He learns the League of Shadows playbook, goes back to Gotham, becomes Batman, becomes a symbol, protects the people he loves while doing his vigilante work and kind of, speeding up the justice process in a way, which has consequences eventually. I'll probably talk about those at some point in the future. If you've seen the Dark Knight series, the Joker and Bane are 2 villains that show up, and really it's kind of the case of bringing a gun to a knife fight. The next guy shows up with a gun, and there's just like this forever escalation. So yeah, there's kind of positive and negative aspects to wanting to help. Like, your actions are always going to have unforeseen consequences. Even if you do good in the short run, could be a long-term negative for something or someone. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means that you got to be ready. Ready for the consequences of good actions, even. And that's life. You got to be prepared. And I think it goes back to Bruce Wayne's dad. Maybe couldn't foresee the fact that they would get held up at gunpoint. And that's something that Bruce obviously overcorrected on. So, and another example of kind of generational trauma and being willing to take on responsibility, like chapter 1, and doing it through fear and vulnerability, chapter 2, and then building yourself up and acting. It's chapter 3. So you can see there's a little bit of a path to a story, which is awesome. I'm glad to see it shaping up. Last thing I'm going to end on, bringing it to the Bear. So if you know anything about the Bear, it's a Chicago family. They own a kind of Italian beef sub shop, and it's kind of a mess. The older brother is into drugs. He's a great guy, but just very troubled again. Kind of has that inertia thing going, and a lot of times people are doing their best, but they're just under this heavy crushing weight, under this immense pressure. And if you can't find a way, if you can't find the tools or get the support you need to make yourself strong enough to create that diamond, to bust through the inertia, you can get stuck. Life will beat you down, and he ended up overdosing on the drugs. And again, that's a physical kind of chemical problem that he was going through, and just wasn't able to beat it. And it's tough. It's emotional, mental, and physical and spiritual problem. And, obviously just couldn't. It's a little bit like whack-a-mole. I'm sure you solve one issue and another one comes up, and that's the struggle of all human beings. But yeah, so his brother dies. He was running the restaurant. Meanwhile, the younger brother, who wanted to get involved in the restaurant and wasn't allowed to, he was kind of forced to go be a chef in the best kitchens and get Michelin stars, and once again get all these tools, and kind of become a version of his best self. And he was also under similar inertia, but instead of getting into drugs, he just ripped a lot of cigarettes and learned how to be one of the best chefs in the world. So this addictive personality type can do all sorts of things, but even a positive addiction that makes you money and gets you accolades still kind of leaves you empty at the end of the day. And I think what he wanted was a relationship with his brother, and he would have worked at the shitty restaurant just to be there with him. And his brother, kind of knowing he was destined for more, sent him away. So something that seemed kind of unkind ended up being really super kind. And I find that to be an aspect of inertia too, is there's two things that are true that are opposing, and you have to just sit with the tension of that. So the tension of that, though, created one of the best chefs, but then his brother dies and he comes home and he takes over the beef shop, and all of his tools are still super valuable, but now rendered useless. Like, he is thrown down into basically a fast food restaurant and has to figure out a way to make it work. And spoiler alert, over the course of 2 seasons or 3 seasons, they change it into a super nice restaurant. And he gets to kind of cook at that Michelin star level again. And it's not without challenges. But again, he's thrown back into that situation. There's a lot of inertia. So he already overcame a bunch of inertia and became one of the best chefs. But then again, when you take like family, emotional, spiritual issues, mental issues, and even the death of a brother, someone as close to you as that, it can pull you back down, and then you're back in the shit and having to do it all over again. A little bit like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill just indefinitely. But luckily, when you get pulled back down, you're still the strong person that busted out the first time. So you kind of see this main character's journey. His name's Carmi. He, is growing as a person. He has a romantic relationship that doesn't really go so well. Relationships with his coworkers that are, a little bit rough around the edges, but ultimately loving. And you just see the growth of this human being. And that's really the will to act. I think I mentioned it before, but love is in the doing or the trying. And I think that's what the will to act is just being willing to go up, even if you're not ready yet, even if that inertia is just holding you down, something serious. It's being willing to take inventory, take stock of where you're at in all the aspects of your life, and just build yourself up, make yourself strong enough to break through that barrier, so you can enjoy some success before life maybe puts you back down. And I think when we talk about will or personal power, I think the goal in life is to be able to win and then lose it all and have the mindset to win it all back again and not be demoralized. I think it's another, I talked about Winston Churchill before on the podcast, but I think it's success is like going from failure to failure with the same amount of enthusiasm, like without losing your enthusiasm. It's something to that degree. And that's a little bit what it is, the will to act. Don't get suffocated under that inertia, because it will hold you down if you let it. And you can let it. You don't have to go up or try to get anywhere. You just have to try while knowing that you could easily just get stuck. And as in Monopoly terms, like, don't collect $200, don't pass go. That kind of thing. Life has a way of just teaching you lessons. And if you can take those lessons with grace, you have a chance to earn some of that grace for yourself. One thing I always try to do is whatever I'm desiring, I try to give it in the world. And I put it out in the world, and it'll come back to me. And it may not come back to me today, tomorrow, next week. But in my experience in life, it has come back to me eventually. So with that, I'm going to end that kind of crazy episode. I feel like I rambled a lot, but I have some time to clarify those thoughts before they get turned into a chapter of a book. But I think the concept is solid, and I'm excited to whittle it down. So until next time, this is Blaine, and I'll be back for episode 46. See y'all later.